On the morning of September 30th, 2014, a two-bedroom apartment in the small town of Papalotla in the Mexican state of Tlaxcala was under quiet surveillance. FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Mexican federal police had been watching the building for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Inside lived a woman in her mid-40s and a teenage girl who had not been to school in years, who rarely left the apartment, and who believed, among other things, that her father was dead. Her name was Sabrina Allen. She was 17 years old, and she had been missing for 12 years. At 11:32 that morning, the team moved in. There was a struggle. A Mexican federal officer sustained a minor injury, and the woman was placed under arrest. By nightfall, Sabrina and the woman she had spent nearly her entire life believing was simply her mother were on a commercial flight to Houston. One of them was going home. The other was going to jail. The break in the case, according to investigators, had come from a single confidential tip received about a month earlier. 12 years of dead ends, false sightings, and a trail that had gone cold more than once. And it came down to one tip, acted on quietly, that finally worked. To understand how a routine weekend visit in the spring of 2002 turned into a 12-year disappearance spanning 2 countries and at least 10 assumed identities, the story has to start earlier, with a marriage that was already coming apart and a little girl in Austin, Texas, who had no idea what was coming. Greg Allen met Dara Marie Lorenz through a dating service. She picked him out of a picture book. After a night out at the movies, the relationship moved quickly. She was, in his later description, pretty and charming, a woman with a lot of interesting stories to tell. It would be years before he understood that many of those stories weren't true. They married, and in 1997 their daughter, Sabrina, was born. Before we go any further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Somewhere out there, someone may have crossed paths with Sabrina or her mother during those 12 years without ever knowing it. That kind of memory matters more than people think. What's documented about Sabrina's earliest years comes mostly through the lens of her parents' unraveling marriage. Greg and Dara divorced around 2000, and the divorce turned into a custody battle. A judge ultimately granted Greg primary custody, with Dara retained as the non-custodial parent, meaning visitation rights, not day-to-day care. For a while, according to people who knew the family, things seemed to be settling into a workable rhythm. Reporting on the case describes a 6-month stretch of court-supervised visitation between mother and daughter that, on the surface, looked like a family finding its way toward cooperative co-parenting. But underneath that surface, according to Greg, warning signs were accumulating. He would later say that friends, neighbors, and even some of Dara's own relatives had approached him in the months following the divorce, telling him she was making plans, that she had talked about taking Sabrina and leaving for Mexico if the custody arrangement didn't go her way. He said she had threatened this outright, more than once. He didn't yet know how seriously to take it. What little is known about Sabrina herself in this window comes from the people who knew her before she disappeared. A childhood friend named Celeste Chavez, who met Sabrina in daycare, later remembered the two of them spending weekends and evenings together, trading giggles the way 4-year-olds do. In the fall of 2001, the two girls dressed up as Disney princesses for Halloween, Sabrina as Snow White, Celeste as Belle, and went trick-or-treating together at an event downtown. It's a small detail, but it's one of the only windows anyone has into who Sabrina was before everything changed. A little girl with a best friend, dressing up for Halloween, with no idea that within 6 months she would vanish from that life entirely. By April of 2002, Sabrina was 4 years old, about a month shy of turning 5. On April 19, 2002, Greg dropped Sabrina off with Dara for what was supposed to be an ordinary weekend visit, part of the established custody schedule. He would later recall the goodbye. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing that told him this would be the last time he'd see his daughter for over a decade. The plan was for Dara to return Sabrina to him by 6 o'clock on the evening of April 21st. That deadline came and went. Dara didn't show up. She didn't call. Greg called the police. What actually happened during that weekend, pieced together later from court documents and investigative reporting, was that Dara had been planning her exit for some time. According to reporting citing FBI sources, a co-worker drove Dara and Sabrina south to Laredo, and from there across the border into Mexico, a country where Dara reportedly already had ties, including relatives in nearby cities and time she'd previously spent in Mexico City. Dara is a smart, calculating person, Greg said years later, reflecting on how the escape had unfolded. It seemed to me, thinking about it now, that she'd spent some time planning all of this. On April 29, 2002, a Texas warrant was issued for Dara's arrest on a charge of interference with child custody. Less than 2 weeks after that, on May 10th, the case escalated to the federal level. Dara was charged with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Sabrina was entered into the missing persons database maintained by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The FBI issued a public wanted bulletin for Dara, describing her, among other identifying details, as someone who may walk with a mild limp and who may have traveled to Mexico, where she has ties. For the Allen family, the search had officially begun. For Dara and Sabrina, a life on the run, one that would stretch across 12 years and at least 2 countries, had already started. Early leads suggested Dara and Sabrina hadn't gone far. In 2003, reporting indicates the two were spotted in Mexico City, living under assumed names, Dara going by Blanca Aurora Fabian Uribe and Sabrina by Adriana Fabian Uribe. But by the time authorities closed in, the two had slipped away again. It was the first of what would become a pattern: a sighting, a lead, an operation mounted, and then nothing. Sabrina's case drew national attention. It was profiled twice on the television program America's Most Wanted, and host John Walsh spoke about it publicly, noting even years into the search that there was still a real chance of getting Sabrina back. That exposure, pictures, and public attention were how missing children like her were most often found. Now that you've heard a little about who Sabrina was before all of this, a girl who dressed up as Snow White with her best friend, who was one weekend visit away from an ordinary childhood, does she remind you of anyone in your own life? Tell me in the comments. Keeping her real, as a person, and not just a case file, is part of what keeps a story like this alive. Over the following years, investigators say Dara worked to stay one step ahead of anyone looking for her. According to the FBI, she used at least 10 different aliases during her time on the run, working various jobs: retail, as a waitress, as a nanny, under names that weren't her own. At one point, she reportedly changed both her own and Sabrina's hair color to avoid detection, a detail confirmed through court documents obtained by local reporters. She was, in Greg's later assessment on the witness stand, calculating and deliberate about staying hidden. Meanwhile, Greg's search consumed the next decade of his life. He learned Spanish. He traveled to Mexico multiple times a year, walking the streets of Mexico City for weeks at a stretch, putting up flyers on signposts and mailboxes, visiting schools, talking to principals and teachers, hoping someone might recognize his daughter. He sent postcards to relatives who might have information. He launched a website, findsabrina.org, that offered a $20,000 reward and posted regular updates on the search, updates that, according to at least one person who followed the case for years online, became something people checked on almost monthly, hoping for news. At one point, Greg managed to obtain a video showing Sabrina performing in a school play, her hair cut short and dyed black as part of what appeared to be a deliberate disguise. It was proof she was alive. It wasn't proof of where. In 2008, With the trail still cold, Greg brought in professional help, retaining Philip Klein, a private investigator with the firm KIC Texas, to run a dedicated search alongside federal authorities. Klein would remain on the case for the next 6 years. For 12 years, Sabrina's family waited, not knowing if she was safe, not knowing if she even remembered them. If you've ever had to wait that long for any kind of answer about anything, I want to hear about it in the comments. That kind of patience deserves to be acknowledged, whatever the outcome. The toll of the search on Greg Allen was, by his own account, enormous. "I was Ahab and the white whale," he said later, describing his single-minded pursuit of his daughter. "I was not going to survive." He faced criticism along the way. People who told him it wasn't a big deal, that Sabrina was, after all, with her mother. "People just don't understand," he said. "I was accused of overstepping my bounds." He kept searching anyway. Life moved forward around the search. Greg remarried. His second wife, Mariana, a Spanish teacher, became an active part of the effort, helping him navigate schools and communities in Mexico during their trips. They had children together, a new family that existed entirely in Sabrina's absence, waiting for a reunion none of them could be sure would ever come. For Sabrina, meanwhile, those same 12 years were shaping a version of reality entirely disconnected from the truth. According to Greg, she was told over the years that he was, in his words, a bad guy, a wife beater, and a child molester. She was reportedly also told that both of his parents, her grandparents, were dead. None of it was true. She grew up isolated, largely out of school, rarely leaving whatever small apartment she and her mother were living in at any given time, absorbing a narrative about her own family that had been constructed for her by the one parent she had left. The break, when it finally came in the fall of 2014, started with a single confidential tip. According to CBS News, the tip was received roughly 4 weeks before the operation that recovered Sabrina, a piece of information that, this time, held up. Investigators traced it to Dara and Sabrina's location in Papalotla, a town southeast of Mexico City, and began 2 weeks of quiet surveillance to confirm what they'd found before making a move. We're about to reach the moment this case finally broke open, after 12 years of near misses and false starts. What do you think it was that finally cracked it? A slip-up, a witness, something else entirely? Drop your guess in the comments before we get there. On the morning of September 30th, 2014, the operation moved forward. FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Mexican Federal Police entered the apartment together. There was resistance during the arrest, enough that a Mexican federal officer sustained a minor injury. But by the account of an acting FBI supervisory special agent on scene, both women calmed after the initial struggle. Dara, reportedly weighing around 105 pounds at the time, was taken into custody. Sabrina, now 17, was taken by investigators for immediate care. What agents and Greg's private investigator found, once Sabrina was safely in custody, painted a picture of the life she'd been living. She had not been enrolled in school for some time. She rarely left the apartment. According to Greg, she had effectively been isolated from the outside world, told a version of her own history built entirely around her mother's account of events. Investigators described her as undergoing a period of manipulation and parental alienation that a therapist would need to help her work through. That night, Sabrina and Dara were flown by commercial flight to Houston. Dara was transferred to the Travis County Jail and booked on charges of aggravated kidnapping and interference with child custody. Sabrina was taken to an undisclosed location in Central Texas, where investigators, bodyguards, and mental health professionals began the process of helping her transition. Something as basic as new clothes and shoes, and an introduction, slowly, to a world she hadn't been part of in over a decade. Greg Allen learned the news while sitting in a dentist chair. He had to rinse his mouth out before he could process it. "I was not going to survive," he said again, this time in relief rather than despair. "It's a long road. You don't know what the outcome is going to be." Even after the arrest, he said, there was a nagging fear it could all fall apart. Dara and Sabrina had evaded capture before. "Is it going to happen again? It's terrifying," he admitted. But it happened. The reunion itself did not happen immediately. In the days after her recovery, Sabrina asked to see Mariana, Greg's wife, before she was ready to see her father. It would take time to process 12 years of a life built on false information, time to begin trusting a family she had been taught, for over a decade, not to trust. In the months that followed, the picture began to shift. Sabrina, according to family statements, graduated high school and enrolled in college, with hopes of becoming a doctor. She began the slow work of rebuilding a relationship with her father, her stepmother, and the half-siblings she had never known. Philip Klein, the investigator who had spent 6 years on her case, said he was proud of how she was adjusting, learning to navigate American life, technology, and social media, all the ordinary things a person misses when they spend 12 years in hiding. For Dara, the legal process moved more slowly. She was formally charged with aggravated kidnapping and interference with child custody. In December of 2015, she pleaded guilty to both counts. A sentencing hearing followed in 2016, spanning multiple days of testimony. Witnesses were called on both sides. A married couple Dara had briefly lived with while going through her divorce testified she had been a wonderful mother to 4-year-old Sabrina. A former roommate testified to different concerns, behavior in young Sabrina that she felt might point to abuse, and said she had encouraged Dara at the time not to flee but to look into it through proper channels. A court-ordered psychological evaluation found that Dara showed some obsessive traits but was not mentally ill. Dara herself did not take the stand, saying through her attorney that her defense had covered all the bases. Her lawyers argued she had fled out of fear that Sabrina was being abused by Greg. Prosecutors presented evidence disputing that claim, and the judge ultimately agreed it did not hold up. Retired Judge Mike Lynch sentenced Dara to 6 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping and 2 years for interference with child custody, to be served concurrently, with credit for time already served. She would be required to serve at least 2 years before becoming eligible for parole. Dara later appealed the conviction, arguing her legal counsel at both the plea and sentencing stages had been inadequate. In October of 2019, Texas's highest criminal appellate court denied that appeal, upholding the original sentence. 12 years after a routine weekend visit turned into a disappearance that spanned 2 countries, 10 assumed identities, and a search that never stopped, Sabrina Allen was finally home. Not to the same childhood she'd left behind, and not to the same family exactly as it had been, but home. A father who had never stopped looking. A stepmother, willing to be the first familiar face in a reunion 12 years in the making. And a case that, in the end, came down to one confidential tip that someone was finally willing to act on. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.